Chapter 20. Objection Overruled. At the conclusion of their meeting, the shepherds departed one by one as usual, Chris having given them a great deal to think about. After the parchment's reveal, he had answered their questions about how the king had named him as his successor. He showed them the robe in his bag as well as the silver medallion in his pocket. Each of the shepherds pledged their loyalty to Chris as the rightful king, but at Chris's pleading, they promised not to announce that support at the coronation. "I will confront the prince publicly," he had told them. "You must gain the support of the people privately. Send word throughout the village about what we know, what I have seen, and what must soon happen." Chris was last to leave the stable. He grabbed his bag and placed Percy's parchment back into his pocket. He had one more important stop to make before calling it a night. His best friend still did not know he was alive. Chris knocked on Jack's door after walking the long trail back from the green pasture. "Who is it?" Jack called out from inside the small house. "St. Nicholas," Chris replied. Jack opened the door hesitantly and peered out at Chris. "I'm sorry, but do I know—" He stopped. It only took him a moment to recognize his friend, and when he did, he tried unsuccessfully to suppress a smile. "You're supposed to be dead," Jack stated, as if he was disappointed. "But then you'd have no friends," Chris shot back. Jack shook his head, his smile widening. "Come inside, St. Nick," he offered. "You've got a lot of explaining to do." Chris stepped inside the house, the warmth from the fireplace immediately bringing a relief from the sting of the cold weather outside. "I know you've got 100 questions," Chris began, "but I only have a time to answer a few." Jack sat down on his armchair and looked up at Chris. "Okay. How about, what were you thinking? Where have you been? And why on earth are you masquerading as a priest?" Chris laughed. "Jack, there is a great deal that has happened since we last saw each other, and a great deal more on the horizon. I need to entrust you with a tremendous responsibility, if you are up to it." Jack, ever one to tease and question, could sense the seriousness in Chris's voice. "I'm listening," he replied. Chris sat down on the opposite armchair in Jack's small living room. He reached into his bag and pulled out King Wenceslas's robe. Jack raised his eyebrows in shock and opened his mouth to say something, but Chris cut him off. "Like I said, I can't answer all your questions. Long story short, I found Wenceslas in the forest, and he named me the new king of Silverbell. I'm going to stand up to Renier tomorrow at the coronation." Jack gave him the same look many of the shepherds had given when hearing Chris's plan. "Are you crazy?" Jack questioned. "He'll kill you." "Not at first," Chris corrected him. "He'll have me arrested almost certainly, but he will have too many questions to kill me outright. He will be too eager to know what I know." Jack looked at him confusedly. "And what exactly do you know?" Chris reached into his pocket and pulled out Percy's parchment. "All the things I know," he replied, holding up the parchment, "are things you can know, too." The next morning, all of Silverbell had once again come together inside the church to witness and take part in the coronation of Lord Renier. Trumpets and drums were sounded to signal the beginning of the ceremony, and the public square within the marketplace had been decorated with colorful banners and flags to celebrate the event. Chris had spent the night in a thicket of trees near the Pinetop Mountains north of the village. He did not want to arouse any suspicion by sleeping in his old house. Besides, after his time with the elves, sleeping in the woods now felt more like home than anywhere else. When he awoke, he put on the king's red and white robe, which fit perfectly thanks to the tailoring work that had been done on it by the elves. He had borrowed a pair of heavy black boots from Jack and put them on over his feet before making the walk to the church. The ceremony had already begun when Chris approached the open doors of the church. 2 guards stood on either side of the entrance, warning Chris that finding an empty seat inside would be impossible. Chris slowly entered the church, just in time to hear the words of St. Martin. "Surely God has determined that Prince Renier should take his father's place as the king of Silverbell. If there are any who feel that this is not the will of heaven in this people, let him speak now." Chris entered more fully into the chapel, making his way up the center aisle toward the rostrum, where he had stood as St. Nicholas the day before. "I object to this coronation," Chris declared in a strong voice. Whisperings and gasps now filled the church as every head turned to see who was making the unexpected objection. Prince Renier, who was standing on the rostrum, looked out at Chris with great confusion displayed on his face. "St. Nicholas," Renier replied aloud, "what are you doing here? And why are you wearing my father's robe?" The whisperings and gasps from the congregation grew more numerous as Chris stood his ground in the middle of the church's aisleway, staring up at Renier on the rostrum. "I object to this coronation," Chris repeated, seemingly undeterred by the great excitement in the room. "This man is not fit to be king. He is a liar and a murderer." Princess Ava, who had been standing next to her brother, looked at Chris with fear-stricken eyes. "King Wenceslaus named another to take his place before his death," Chris continued, turning to the congregation. "And it was not Prince Renyer." "Who, then?" Renyer asked aloud with a stern face, the royal guards at the back and front of the chapel positioning themselves to attack or arrest the objector when called upon. "Here I am," Chris answered. The murmurings throughout the congregation grew louder as Renyer now descended slowly from the rostrum to meet Chris in the aisleway. "You say my father named you king," Renyer confirmed with an air of disgust. "Saint Nicholas, a lowly priest from a foreign kingdom." "No," Chris replied, looking Renyer right in the eyes as he approached. "It's worse than that. I am nothing more than a farm boy, and my name is Kris Kringle." The crowd's response at the reveal was so loud that the guards cried out for them to be silent. "Kris Kringle," Renyer repeated as he recalled the name. "You're supposed to be dead." "And your father? He was supposed to be dead too, wasn't he?" Chris returned hotly. Renyer's eyes flashed with rage. "How dare you!" he cried. "How dare you wear the robes of my father? A king!" He punched Chris in the mouth, sending him to the ground. The crowd gasped again, and Chris slowly picked himself off the ground, wiping the small trickle of blood oozing out of his lip. "The robe wouldn't fit you anyway," Chris replied smartly. "It's too big." Renyer raised his hand as if to strike a second time, but was stopped by his advisor, Monty. "Farm boy," Monty addressed Chris coldly. "What witnesses do you have to what you claim? From where I stand, I see a man who murdered our beloved King Wenceslaus and stole his emblems in order to take the kingdom from his son, the rightful successor. Are there any that can attest to the authenticity of your story?" Chris's mouth hung open as he searched hopelessly for an answer. He looked up at Ava on the rostrum, who stood there with great anxiety, not knowing what to do or say. There were elves," Chris began to stutter. Renyer laughed aloud, with many in the congregation joining him. "Elves," the prince repeated in a comedic tone. "Made-up creatures can confirm your made-up story." Chris stood there defeated. He could say nothing. Renyer stopped laughing and motioned for his guards. "Arrest this man for treason and for the murder of good King Wenceslaus." There were a few cheers from the crowd as 4 guards immediately surrounded Chris and pulled him away from the prince. As he was dragged away, he could see Ava frantically trying in vain to persuade her brother to set the madman free. From across the church in one of the alleyways of the marketplace, Jack watched as his best friend was carried out of the church and toward the castle to be imprisoned. "I hope you know what you're doing, friend," Jack muttered to himself softly. He removed the top hat from his head and looked inside it. The magical parchment that Chris had entrusted in his care was rolled up and securely fastened inside.